So my name is Freya Berg, and I head up partnerships here at Snorkel. And today what we wanted to do is talk about delivering business value with data-centric AI, specifically in financial services. So I'm joined here today by two experts in the space. I'll let them introduce themselves. Peter, could you do a quick intro?
Sure, thanks Freya. I'm Peter Williams. I lead our AWS Global Financial Services Partner Technical Team. We work with large banks and insurance companies to help them in their journey to the cloud. And appreciate you having me here.
Yeah, and hi, I'm Brian Wood. I'm a solutions engineer at Snorkel. So my day job is basically helping customers understand our technology, understand their problems and trying to make connections there. Prior to joining Snorkel, I was with Bank of America for almost 20 years, so have a lot of experience in financial services.
Well, tell you what, Brian, let's start using your experience in financial services, and let's talk a little bit about what some of the key drivers are for banks and for other large financial services providers.
Sure. First, quick, just want to poll the audience. Who works in financial services or kind of adjacent? Okay. Perfect, you're in the right spot. All right. Who works in the line of business, in a profit center? All right, couple, good, all right. So I always worked in the commercial bank. I started as an analyst, and my last job there was head of AI and data strategy for the commercial bank. So my boss, was responsible for, $1 trillion worth of credit. It's a big portfolio. And one thing I learned over the years is that they want to talk about revenue. Especially, if you're not in the line of business, if this isn't, what the normal dialogue is, the thing I want to maybe help deliver here is that you should always look at how you can orient your story around revenue, right? It's not about what models you're going to build or, how you're going to do it. It's all about how much money you're going to make. Kind of secondary, right? You want to increase client count, right? Build a more diverse pool of clients. And then also increase client satisfaction. That's what makes that revenue sticky. But when you think about AI strategy or any AI projects, it is really important to point back to revenue. And there's sort of two parts to that as well. One is taking revenue from the other banks, right? So I was at Bank of America. We were always worried about what are the other banks doing? Are we growing? Are they growing? But that's a finite pool, right? You can only kind of I can use this term because I'm from the industry. The pig trough is only so big, right? And you can muscle each other out, but at the end of the day, it's only so big. And that's the same problem if you orient your business cases around expense reduction, because they can only go to zero. So, but by focusing your AI strategy on what markets you can create and what products you can create, you start to tell a story of how you can grow revenue exponentially, which, based on my, near 20 years kind of working for people that lead these industries, is what resonates with them. Because assuming you guys operate similar to the enterprise I came from, these places there's a lot of scarce resources. There's a lot of good ideas around AI. Everyone probably has an idea for AI. A lot of them are going to be how you can cut expenses, how you can automate things, grow that revenue base. But if you can really put together a narrative of how your ultimate vision is to create new markets and new sources of revenue, you're going to start to really capture the attention of the business leaders. And it's really important because, you can have the best ideas, you can have the best strategy, the best AI, but if you can't communicate it to someone that is solely obsessed with revenue, you might not ever have a chance to pull it off. And so I will say, I was really good at this. I always had funding. I'm not trying to brag, but I was probably responsible for spending several $100 million on technology in a bank. So I got to drive my ideas, I got to experiment, and I don't have a PhD, right? I'm not the most AI savvy person, but I knew how to create visions and tell stories and put it in terms that were going to resonate with the business. And a story about how to kind of grow the whole market is always going to win over how do you take bits and pieces from the other banks, or how do you whittle away at expenses? Because you're putting together a story of how to grow something exponentially that's infinite versus how you tackle, sort of finite resource pool.
So maybe talk a bit more about how you think about AI in financial services and how people should be thinking about the opportunity that exists.
Yeah. So we've got a quote here. I won't read it for you. And again, I'm allowed to say this because I worked at Bank of America, and you get very comfortable being in second place to JP Morgan. It's fine, particularly in the commercial bank. But I have to say, I'm really, really impressed with Jamie Dimon's view on AI. I think this quote just completely nails it, which is, they're convinced that the consequences will be extraordinary, but they don't know why yet, right? And I think we all kind of got this feeling, I'll call when ChatGPT came out day zero, right? So it's almost exactly 2 years ago. And you kind of get that feeling of this new magical technology, and particularly if you lived through scaling of the internet and computing, and you think back to when I first got online in I don't know, 92, 94, whatever, if you were only 2 years into that, if you're in the mid-90s on the internet, you still have no perspective of where it's going. And so that's why I think this is such a great quote, because it's it feels like one of those really material pieces of technology, right? So imagine blockchain, okay? Not to pick on blockchain, great technology, great use cases, but there were always a lot of really, really smart people saying, this doesn't make sense, right? Or this isn't going to scale, these use cases aren't going to materialize. And no one is really saying that about AI right now. It's a very optimistic kind of vibe in the industry right now. It's more about what is possible, where is all this going? And so I'm willing to say I don't know what the killer use case is, right? We're all focused on RAG right now, and I think that's interesting, but I don't think RAG is what's gonna, 10 years from now, we're not gonna look back and be thankful for all these RAG systems, right? There's gonna be something else coming. And I love using a banker's quote for it. And I think another thing that's good to keep in perspective, I love this, Amara's Law. I will read this one. We tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short run and underestimate the effect in the long run. I think this pairs up really well with what Jamie Dimon said. And the way just to make it a little more concrete, right? When ChatGPT came out, and it wasn't the first LLM, it was kind of the first product that made it widely available. But there was that sense of oh, in 2 years, this is going to replace all these jobs and replace all this stuff. And it's always 2 years. It's always 2 years out, no matter what. It's 2 years from today. 2 years ago, it was 2 years from there. And in 2 years, it's going to be 2 years from then. And it's because when you look in the rear view, you've digested all of that technology, you understood it, you went through the motions. It's common at that point, and you understand it. But when you look into the future, it's kind of unknown. So I think there's always this perception that some exponential takeoff is just around the door. And so I think it's good to kind of keep that in perspective and not get too focused on the hype cycle. Because another thing I like to think about is compared to 2 years ago, the way I use computers and AI is not all that much different than how it was 2 years ago. It's maybe less than 5% different, maybe even less than that. I would say the number one thing is I use Google less, right? I just ask my questions in an LLM now, and instead of going to a search engine. That's the big thing that happened for me personally in the last 2 years. And so I like to keep that in perspective, and I think it's good to kind of anchor around this hype cycle because again, 2 years ago, everything was going to happen in 2 years. And people started all these POCs, and they got really great results. And if you've really gotten hands-on with a lot of this stuff, you've probably started to slide down this curve and realize that it's actually hard work, and it goes back to a lot of fundamentals that we've always been dealing with. So the good news here is you already know how to do this because the problems are not really any different than the problems that you've always had. And by that I mean it's the data, right? Whether it's your training data or your more traditional data management, your AI strategy is your data strategy. And so I think, that's a good place to just kind of ground here and think that this actually isn't so different than what we've been doing all along.
And I'd say that's a perfect tee-up for Peter, because Peter's gone through, first of all, we've all seen the hype cloud happening with cloud as well, and it'll be here in 2 years. And then now thinking about data, maybe you can dive a little bit more into what are the challenges and what are people thinking about with data strategy?
Yeah, and it's really interesting to also tie back to not only the hype cycle, but kind of the journey that you've had, Brian, at B of A in using AI to achieve outcomes in the credit desk, in the cases you've talked about with the CLO document analysis, finding specific business value and reasons why you can justify whether it's investment in AI or investment in moving to the cloud. Is something that we find to be really essential. Amazon sees a lot of customers that are looking at their entire data center and many data centers right around the world. 50 years of history and systems and data that they don't always know what is there actually and where the data is, and they're looking at how they move it to the cloud, and it's overwhelming. And that's actually a lot of where we spend our time at Amazon, is helping customers demystify that journey, taking specific business outcomes and helping wrap that outcome around that process and that journey to the cloud. And when it comes to moving your data into the cloud so that you can get value out of it with analytics, and nowadays with AI, there's a lot of sort of rethink about how do you manage your data. So customers historically have over the past kind of up to about 5 years ago, we're looking at a lot of data warehousing technologies, centralizing of data management, and figure out how they can provide a single source that consolidates data in a single area that can be used across the company. Now, as they're moving to the cloud, they're realizing that technologies are enabling them to really be much more agile with their data, and by federating how they're managing their data sets and enabling different teams. Imagine, so the team that you were working with, Brian, at B of A, managing credit data, right? You guys were the experts in CMBS and CLOs and all of the credit products. And you ought to be in a position to manage that, to own that data set and provide it to the rest of the company. In a centralized model, it's very challenging, actually, because you've got to work, not only innovations you might add in your team at B of A can then have to be copied and transformed by the central team before anybody can use it. As customers are moving to the cloud, they're looking at how they decentralize that and use a data mesh, data fabric, architecture and approaches, and moving away from that centralized approach so they can get access to the data they need. And the reality is, it's going to be a 10-year process and journey for most banks and insurance companies to move everything into the cloud where they can achieve the scalability that they'd like to with their data. So it's not going to be moving everything to the cloud and then using AI, right? You've got to come up with a stepwise journey. And that's where, coming back to kind of looking at a business outcome, as you're designing, what are you trying to do for your business? Are you trying to analyze CMBS documents? Are you trying to help your customers across, we have customers in insurance, for example, that are looking at how do they take signals from their calls that they get for customer support and identify new capabilities to offer that customer new products based on life changes. So just analyzing literally millions of calls a month by some large insurance companies, they can then identify customers who are having a life change event. Maybe they're selling their house, maybe they're retiring. It's a good opportunity to think about, should we go out to them and offer them a new product? In the consumer space, in the banking world, being able to identify credit capabilities. We're seeing a lot of customers that are very focused on specific outcomes so that they can bring the data sources they need into the cloud and then harness that using AI capabilities. And I think taking that stepwise approach, very focused on outcomes, has been really essential. In fact, Amazon advocates for, early in the cloud journey, a lot of customers would take something that was low risk that they're trying to move to the cloud. what we found is those workloads tended to not be successful. It takes doing something that's really business critical, that's important to your leadership, to get the right support to make it possible.
That's a good point.
And so that's definitely something that we advocate for. I think one of the things that in the data space, more and more technologies like Iceberg are making capabilities, because customers will use kind of every product actually under the sun to store their data, right? We have customers using Snowflake, Databricks, Redshift, KDB, S3, and they need to bring that data together, knowing that each of the teams that own that data is now the shepherd of it and making it available across their organization. They need to be able to make that centrally available. And so it's causing a lot of sort of innovation and customers to rethink how they're managing their data so they can be much more agile in terms of their business outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, that totally resonates. That's the strategy we were going with at Bank of America. I love the Iceberg Starburst type architecture. I also love the focus of data strategy. So this was one thing we had done within the commercial bank, was essentially combine those functions of AI and data strategy, by essentially coming to the conclusion that your AI is derived from your data. They need to be managed as one thing and ultimately kind of go after the same business outcomes.
Let's talk a little bit more about what the journey looks like. And so first, one of the things we talked about when we were preparing was about just the spectrum of AI use cases. So maybe we can use capital markets as an example, and you can talk about how all the different areas that AI can touch across the life cycle.
Yeah, it's interesting to see as so many customers are working with AWS in financial services to transform how they're achieving their business outcomes in new ways. It's really interesting to think about the whole life cycle in capital markets. Bridgewater's been very public in using research and Gen AI with the research to have an automation around their research capabilities. The ability to take unstructured data and combine it with structured data at speed, using generative AI and other AI capabilities is super exciting, because it's automating a lot of the laborious work of sifting through changes. Imagine news events coming in, earnings calls, harnessing all of that unstructured world, and then giving signals to your analysts. In some cases, they're providing research to their customers. In other cases, they're making trading and risk decisions, and it's really increasing the speed of decision making, which is super exciting to see. As you can see here across the whole trade life cycle, whether it's pre-trade analytics, post-trade assessments, we're seeing FINRA in the space of compliance and surveillance, the scale at which a surveillance organization like FINRA has to operate, the ability to use generative AI capabilities and AI capabilities to really give signals as soon as possible. It's tremendous. Even Fannie Mae we have in the risk management space. The scalability combined with these new technologies is super exciting to see in financial services.
Definitely impressive to see that breadth of opportunity. I would love to come back though, Brian. I know that you've been involved, and Snorkel of course is involved in working with a number of customers through these specific projects, and there's usually lessons learned at each step of the way. So Brian, maybe you can talk us through a couple projects and talk about what the journey was like getting to that production value and getting to that business value.
Yeah, so I like putting this on the curve as well. I would say, the number one thing we see is these kind of out-of-the-box models. It kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the hype cycle and the expectation that these things are going to perform miracles. So kind of, I don't think it's bad to start with a POC that's based on out-of-the-box models. I think sometimes, though, you do try and see people beat that idea to death before they realize that it needs to be tuned, it needs to be trained on your own data. So I think you don't want to get stuck there. That's kind of where you hit that 25% accuracy out of the box that we're seeing there. And then as you kind of move up the curve, you start to develop your data. Some of the other lessons that we kind of see in this space is just places trying to maybe go a little too broad and not necessarily cherry picking the best use cases. Like I was trying to say at the beginning of the call, is you really want to orient around your company's objectives. And if you're in financial services, it's okay to just say that the objective is revenue, right? I mean, compliance, expense reduction, those are all good things. Everyone is concerned about those too. But those are like KPIs on like the third page of the deck. The revenue is going to be the headline number that you have to ultimately tie to. So sometimes just kind of going into these more from a technology first perspective. I've seen a lot of use cases where they wanted to use Gen AI, and they did, but they were solving a problem that probably should have been a more traditional classification model, you know? Yep. So one of the early uses of Gen AI that I had was actually, well, working with Snorkel, but using it to label data. So it's like we knew we didn't want to put Gen AI in production to tell us what the date of a document was. That didn't make sense 4 years ago, and it definitely doesn't make any sense today. But to create the data, to create a more traditional, you know, whether it's like an SVM, XGBoost, whatever type model, creating training data with an LLM was a perfect use case. And so that's something we went after. And so, you know, coming at this from the perspective of like, what can the technology do, and, you know, trying to force a use case just because you can, I think is another place where, you know, we try and guide people back towards business outcome and just make sure you're not chasing the technology just to do it. I'll admit I was guilty about that for a long time in my career, right? I always wanted to be the first person using the latest stuff, and I thought that was kind of the goal. You get out in front and everyone's going to come around and say, wow, congratulations, Brian, you're so smart. You did blockchain before everyone else. No one cared, right? No one cared at all. You know, we were the first ones that were experimenting with like tuning small language models back in 2017, but like we weren't as good at tying it to business outcomes back then. And so, you know, for me to really like start to advance from that sort of like management to like managing director level took sort of rethinking and just being honest with myself around what is this place here for, right? It's here to make money, and I have to talk in those terms. And being interested in the technology is great. But I think it's something I could have done personally better early in my career.
It's really interesting to think about because, and if you think about sort of Jamie Dimon's vision earlier that you showed, he's got this ability, and we've seen this a lot at Amazon, his ability to think and kind of get the opportunity, knowing that the bank, you know, his organization needs to move in a certain direction without knowing exactly, as you said, what the outcome is going to be yet. Mm-hmm. So what we do see a lot is the importance of building a muscle around what are the technologies, because it's hard when you've never used any of these to say, well, what could I do? What's possible? Yeah. And it's a little bit of a you know, a bottoms up and a top down model where you have to sort of experiment with the capabilities, know what it really could mean for you, and then come back up to top down and think about, okay, now that I know something, how could I actually improve the efficiency of my organization? What are the opportunities? And then again, it's going to be that technology evolves and it's up, top down and bottom up.
Yeah, I think Jamie Dimon does a great job of setting that tone at the top. I mean, not to just congratulate Jamie Dimon for this whole thing, but whether it's cloud or Gen AI, I feel like he makes a very clear direction and mandate from the top. Yeah. You know, maybe more so than some of the other bank CEOs, and I think that's really effective because it just gives a strategy to the organization that's difficult to bubble from the bottoms up. That said, I think, you know, if a company is early in their journey with Gen AI, you do want to start from the bottom up. I think the number one thing companies can do is simply enable their employees with Gen AI and educate them. So don't target, hey, we're going to automate this process or this use case. Just give them, you know, for lack of a better term, ChatGPT, but in a safe manner, right? So the data's not getting exposed. Give the employees education, you know, teach them how to use it. So now that I've left the bank, I was able to reveal in my other presentation that one of my first uses of Gen AI at work was to write employee reviews, right? But like, I knew better than to put specific bank information in that prompt, right? I would obfuscate it. But I would use it to do this writing because I found it really tedious, and it was just it was just organizing my bullet points. Yeah. And so like, I think enabling people to experiment and find those benefits is the number one thing that companies can do, because I think one thing unique about Gen AI is the benefits are going to come to the individuals first, the people that are going to use it and learn how to use it, and then they're going to become the advocates for it that teach everyone else, that say, look, I found that it's great for writing these reviews, now I'm going to teach you how to do it, and then those might become enterprise projects. And I think it's important to have education around that too. There's a big disconnect, like some people are using AI in the shadows at work a lot, right? And some people have never used AI. And I think that's, we need to get it to where everyone's using AI, but out in the open, because that's how people are going to learn. It's how those big opportunities are going to ultimately manifest themselves.
So can you step through a little bit more of a specific example about where people might start using it and get started? For example, we have the example here of a legal chatbot that somebody started using with an LLM, and then they had a lot of learnings from that and moved forward. Can you talk about kind of what that evolution looks like?
Yeah, the first step, like I was recommending, I would call that, I like to think of things as like crawl, walk, run. Again, that's a great framework for communicating to executives. They get really excited when they see it because they're like, I know exactly what that means. It's amazing. So, that first use case is just kind of enablement. The second use case is going to be where you have found a couple of specific places where this is useful. So if people have found that, hey, dumping legal documents into AI and asking questions is a good utility, and they've trained other people and they're starting to look at that, this is where we kind of get into that walk phase. And I think one thing that's important about the walk phase is to not spread too thin. Like pick 3 to 5 things that are important and that you want to be good at. That's enough that you have diversity, so you've built your foundation to support a lot of different types of use cases. But don't go after every document type that exists. Just make sure that you're coordinated across the enterprise, because there's so few resources going into that. And so that's when we get into like, okay, it's a good idea to do this legal chatbot. And out of the box, it might work okay. Again, it's promising. But to really get to that walk phase of things is where you need to start tuning and managing your data. So whether it's the pipelines to make sure that your latest legal documents are present in your database, and whether it's some of the retrieval optimization that I was talking about earlier, or the model optimization, ultimately your goal is going to be to get something useful in production. And that's, think of it as you're going to need like 90+% accuracy for this to really like show a lot of value. And you're not going to want to spread too thin on that. But what that's going to give you is it's not going to materially change what people do. It's going to make part of their life easier. And so the next phase after that, and we don't see, I'll just say I don't see anyone there right now, right? People are still building that kind of like walk phase, and you're seeing people get comfortable with it. But where you want to go next is once you have that capability, once it's reliable, how do you then reimagine your process around it to, basically make your sort of, we'll say AI native, like your processes. But again, I think most people are kind of just getting to that walk phase. Yeah. And, the biggest lessons or the biggest kind of advice, again, it always goes back to the data, whether it's the traditional data management or, the labeling in the Snorkel's case.
It reminds me of, I know that we have a customer at Snorkel, it's a large bank, and they were going through the legal documents exactly as you mentioned, and they built a chatbot, and these are extensive 200 to 500 page legal documents. And the first thing that they found after they built it and they built the Gen AI chatbot was that they didn't even know how to evaluate it. That's one of the challenges with Gen AI is that it's very easy if you're building a predictive model, it's either yes or no, it's accurate. But when you're building a generative AI model, how do you make sure that it gets the right information? How do you make sure it has the right tone? Verbosity becomes an issue. There are all sorts of different terms. And you've probably heard things about evaluation here. I know that there'll be a lot of discussion in the session after this, but it's a consideration that is often secondary as people are building cool Gen AI pilots to get something built, and then they realize they have to figure out how they evaluate the success of this custom, very domain-specific piece. So in this case, the bank was at about 20% once they figured out how to do a full evaluation. And so then they had to work on, how do I work with the data? How do I work to optimize my RAG system? How do I drive chunking of my RAG? And so they were able to get to that 90% quality bar to push that into production, but it took a lot of data development to get from that last mile of building your initial prototype, impressing all of the stakeholders, getting everybody excited about it, and actually getting to something that could be reliably put into production for people to count on it day to day in their jobs.
That's one of the things that we've seen a lot, especially customers, as they're trying to build their muscle, they'll do POCs, and we've seen a lot of POCs, but getting beyond the POC to, as you say, production, is a number of steps. One, some of the, whether it's evaluation of the models critical at scale, we see before they kind of can scalably assess these models, it's a lot of human assessment, which doesn't really scale very well. But even before that, when it comes to refining your data, tuning your models, it's the and I think you kind of touched on this earlier, Brian, the ability to see impressive results quickly from an LLM is amazing. But then when you go try to harness it and reliably use that AI capability, it's a lot of work to make sure that you've got your clean data, that you've properly labeled your data at scale, and so that's actually, those are the steps that we see are critical to customers before they actually can start using these in production. And the other aspect that we didn't touch on, but that is also, I think, top of mind for customers is, how do you govern this, and what type of models are you creating? We don't see a lot of externally facing models yet, but the whole governance assessment, which is a moving target a bit, right? All of the rules are not fully established yet. That's another aspect. But that's exciting to see a lot of our customers starting to get closer to production, and some of them in production. So we're getting there.
I think that governance piece is really critical too. Like, kind of just going back to lessons learned. When I think about like my younger self, it was like, oh, this is annoying, right? They're in my way trying to do this stuff, and but actually partnering with MRM, governance, compliance, trying to help them understand what's important and what's not important. Which, like eval, like you mentioned, Freya, I think is a place that really should be a conversation you're having with those governance functions, because everything is just going to go a lot smoother if everyone's at the table defining that, and making sure that they're measuring stuff that matters, and that they're doing it in a thoughtful way, and it's not just sort of governance theater, because there's going to be a process no matter what, right? No one's going, the regulators aren't going to let anyone get away with releasing Gen AI in production without some thorough testing, et cetera. So you're going to have to do the work no matter what. So like, make sure you're actually spending those cycles on something productive.
I think that's a great point. And one of the discussions that we were having earlier was about model risk management. And okay, you've built a prototype and you're getting ready to push that into production, but you're going to have to go through a whole series of model risk management. Did you really need an LLM? Did you need this? Can you talk a little bit about one of the recent Gen AI copilots that involved both Snorkel and AWS, Brian? Because I think that actually illustrates everything we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I like it too, because it's a very common pattern, right? A customer, using AWS and kind of the toolkit that comes with that, whether it's, model inference, embeddings, vector database, had kind of just used an out-of-the-box LLM system, and they really didn't have a good eval. I would say when we started looking at it, they had kind of a thumbs up, thumbs down, right? A very coarse-grained eval. You kind of know this acceptance rate, but you don't know what it's good at, what it's bad at. You don't know if you have retrieval errors or generation errors. And that's where, we always recommend starting with eval, right? There's no point in tuning anything until you've done the diagnostics. And so partnering with them on that phase was really critical to kind of understand which parts of that system needed to be tuned, to ultimately, develop the data within Snorkel Flow and then tune those models using AWS inference services, and then finally deploying it out there. And again, I would say that, from a governance perspective, it's something where Snorkel is not necessarily always front and center, but we've partnered with our customers closely on helping them define that. And I think, one of the things that we've found that resonates quite a bit is, one, data management. You're going to have to develop your data to tune these systems. And when you're doing that with kind of like manual annotations and humans, I think that can lack a lot of transparency. I mean, I have found in my own experience that humans are around 85% accurate, and they agree around 85% of the time. And so, trying to explain to MRM how you got these annotations or what they mean is often going to be difficult. And as these models get more commoditized and sophisticated, you're going to find that you're actually spending way less time on model development, model tuning. You're changing your data to tune these models. So, MRM is starting to look more like, how did you curate this data? And I think that's where, tools like that are available on AWS, whether it's the broader data management space or the data development space like Snorkel, which really provides transparency into how your data is labeled, because you're doing it through functions that are explainable, transparent, starts to tie back into your MRM process. So I think it's good to take a broad view of MRM and think about it from your data all the way to your output. Don't think of it as like just the modeling component.
And just to add to that, I think the ability to catalog the parameters, as you're saying, how did we train the model? How did we clean our data, and be able to track that and actually rewind, whether it's for your model risk management committee or for regulatory approvals, actually makes a huge difference. And so that's a key benefit we see customers starting to understand.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I would say also just one, on that one final thing on that topic is just a word of caution. There's a lot of stuff out there that's kind of like the pitch is magic, right? It's like, oh, you just give it feedback and then it learns. I never pursued much of this myself for a couple reasons. One was when we put models in production, they always outperformed humans. So the idea of taking a human's input and then retraining that model in production didn't make any sense, because my expectation would be that it's going to degrade the performance, because we made sure our data was perfect before we built the model. The other thing to think about too is you can't have a model out in production that just mutates based on a user's input, right?
Yeah.
So if somebody says thumbs up, that's a good response, and then that becomes part of the context for the next user. I mean, maybe MRM will approve it, maybe they won't, but think about it from the perspective of you're deploying a model that's just going to change itself based on the whims of its users. It kind of doesn't make any sense when you think about it that way. So I would avoid some of the approaches that appear to be shortcuts, and just be really diligent about how you manage the data that's going into it. Make sure it's perfect.
Excellent feedback. Well, tell you what, I'm very conscious we've got about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you for 2 key takeaways. And they can be things you've mentioned already, but just 2 high-level bulleted takeaways that you would share for people when they get back in the office tomorrow that they should be thinking about as they look at their AI strategy. So I'll go ahead and start with you, Peter, or do you want me to start with Brian first?
That's fine.
Okay.
So, one, build your muscle. Help your organization to get access to the technologies that are available, so that you can start understanding the tools that are now available. And 2, be laser focused on something business critical for your organization.
God, those were my same too, so I'm going to have to make up some stuff on the spot. But yeah, just, definitely building muscle memory. Being focused on fewer things, not spread too thin. Putting those into business terms, because again, the best ideas aren't always going to bubble up to the top. It's going to be the best stories, and you're not going to get anywhere without funding and a narrative. And then 3 is be really, really ambitious, all right? No one is looking for you to tell you how they're going to save money or automate a process. They want a narrative about what banking can do for its customers 5 to 10 years from now. And be ambitious with setting that North Star. So when you think about the future, the run phase, don't think about how AI is going to do something that's already done. Of course, you're going to, we all talk about agents now, right? You're going to have an agent, all these agents are going to do all these things. They're going to replace what humans are doing. But that sounds fun to say the word agent, but it's kind of table stakes, right? You're going to use technology to automate a process. That's nothing new. It's not interesting. So like, what can Gen AI actually do that other technology couldn't? It can develop strategies and ideas. And so like, I can't necessarily give you the answer on what the killer app is in 5 years, but just be really ambitious with it and don't think in terms of using it to do something that already exists, thinking about what it can do that doesn't exist right now.
Okay. Thank you very much. And everybody, big round of hands for our participants. Thank you.
Thank you.